My husband died 3 months ago, but every Tuesday, someone was still waiting for him.
She measured the coffee the same way he did. 2 scoops. Level. No more, no less. Not because she had always done it that way, because El Nathan had every single morning for 46 years, and somewhere along the way his habits had become hers without either of them noticing. That was the quiet arithmetic of a long marriage. You absorbed the other person so gradually that by the time they were gone, you could not always tell which parts of yourself had existed before them. Brunella Voss stood at the kitchen counter and waited for the kettle. She was 72 years old and she had been a widow for 3 months. Not 3 months and a few days. 3 months exactly. She had stopped counting the days sometime in the second week because counting made it feel like a sentence with an end, and she had already understood that this particular thing had no end. It only changed shape. The kitchen was quiet in the way that houses become quiet when one person is missing from them. Not silent. The refrigerator hummed. The baseboard heat ticked against the wall. A branch somewhere outside scraped against the eave in the wind. But underneath all of it was a stillness that had not been there before October. A stillness that lived in the empty chair across the table, and in the second mug she no longer reached for, and in the way she still turned slightly when she spoke as though someone might answer. The chair had a worn place on the left arm where El Nathan used to rest his hand. She had noticed it for the first time 2 days after the funeral, and she had not been able to stop noticing it since. She opened the blinds halfway. El Nathan had always said morning light should enter a room gently, that there was something almost rude about flooding a kitchen with full sun before 8 o'clock. She had teased him about that once. He had smiled in that patient way of his and never changed the habit. The kettle began to hum. She was thinking about the worn place on the chair arm when the phone rang. It rang twice before she picked it up, wiping her hand against her cardigan the way she always did before answering a habit she had never examined and could not explain. "Hello." A man's voice came through, low, deliberate, unfamiliar in the way that certain voices are unfamiliar, even when you have heard them before because you have only ever heard them in passing, never directed at you with any weight. "Is El Nathan there?" Brunella's eyes moved automatically to the chair across from her, the worn place on the left arm. She said what she had said 7 or 8 times now to various people who had not yet heard. She said it gently because she had learned in these 3 months that the words themselves were less important than the tone that people needed a moment to adjust. That cruelty was not the same as clarity, even when the facts were the same. "He passed away 3 months ago," she said. "I'm sorry to be telling you." The silence that followed was not the usual kind. Most people filled it quickly with condolences or with the soft, embarrassed clearing of the throat that meant they did not know what to say and were ashamed of that. This silence was different. It lasted a beat too long. It felt in a way she could not immediately name deliberate. Then the man said something that did not fit the moment at all. "That's strange," he said, almost to himself. The way a person talks when they are working through a problem and have forgotten anyone else is listening. Brunella straightened slightly. She tightened her grip on the receiver. "Excuse me," she said. "I called last week," the man said. "And the week before that." No answer. He paused again. He never misses Tuesday. The kettle behind her had reached a full whistle, but she did not move. "Who is this?" she said. "Barnwell," the man said. "Barnwell Crane." The name settled into place slowly, the way names do when you have heard them only a few times and always in a context that did not require you to remember them. Barnwell Crane. She knew him. Not well. She had met him a handful of times over the years, always briefly, always at the edge of something rather than at the center. He was a tall man, somewhat stooped from decades of physical work, with gray hair cut close and a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent steadiness. Not warm exactly, but not distant either. The kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying. She had met him once on the front porch when El Nathan introduced him without much detail. Once at a small gathering years ago where Barnwell had stood near the wall most of the evening, watching more than speaking. There had been something in him she had noticed without ever examining, a quality of carrying weight without complaint. "Yes," she said. "I remember you. I'm sorry, I didn't know." Behind her, the kettle was still going. She reached back without looking and turned off the burner. Barnwell exhaled quietly. "He told us not to call," he said. She frowned. "Not to call." "If he ever missed a few weeks," Barnwell said, "he told us he would come back when he could, that we should wait." That sounded like El Nathan. That was exactly how Elnathan thought. If something made sense to him, he rarely felt the need to justify it to anyone else. He trusted other people to follow the logic without being walked through it. But it's been 3 months, Barnwell said. Yes, Brunella said, it has. Another pause. Then there's something you need to see. There's a storage facility on Garrison Road in Millbrook. Come next Tuesday, around 9. Brunella sat down slowly in the chair nearest to her. Not Elnathan's chair. She had not sat in Elnathan's chair since he died and did not think she would for a long time yet. What's there, she said. A part of Elnathan's life, Barnwell said carefully, that you haven't seen. She stayed on the phone for another minute, asking questions that Barnwell answered only partially in the way of someone who has decided that some things cannot be explained and must be witnessed. When the call ended, she sat with the receiver still in her hand, the kitchen quiet around her, and tried to locate the feeling that was rising in her chest. It was not grief. She knew grief by now. She knew its particular weight and texture, the way it sat behind the sternum, like something that could not be dislodged. This was something else, smaller, but with an edge to it. He never misses Tuesday. She set the phone down on the table and looked at the empty chair. 46 years. She had known every room in this man's life, or she had believed she had. She knew how he took his coffee and how he folded a newspaper and how he sat in the evenings with one ankle crossed over the other knee, turning the pages of whatever he was reading with a patience she had always admired. She knew his silences as well as his words, knew which silences meant contentment and which meant he was working through something he was not ready to say aloud. Tuesday, she turned the word over. He had always left on Tuesdays. Not occasionally, not when it was convenient. Always. At nearly the same time each week in his brown coat or that old blue flannel shirt he had refused to throw away for 20 years. He would check the clock above the kitchen doorway, before leaving tap the glass once in that small ritual he had never explained, and then he would say simply, I'll be in Millbrook today, or just meeting Barnwell. And she had never asked more than that because the tone had never invited more. It had sounded like something that did not require examination. She poured the coffee she no longer wanted and sat across from the empty chair and tried to remember if she had ever asked. Really asked. She did not think she had. The next morning, Cressida called. Cressida Voss was the widow of Elnathan's son from a brief first marriage, a son who had died young before Brunella had come into Elnathan's life. She was 48 years old, trim and efficient, with a manner that was always just formal enough to maintain a kind of distance. She was not unkind. She had simply decided at some point that the world ran more smoothly when everyone understood their position in it. She called before 9, which was itself a kind of message. She said she had been thinking about the estate. She said there might be financial documents in Elnathan's study that needed to be reviewed, that she had spoken to someone who thought it might be worth looking at any investment accounts that hadn't been disclosed during probate. She said all of this in the smooth, even tone of someone who had rehearsed it. Brunella listened to the entire thing without interrupting. Then she said that the study was not something she was ready to open to anyone yet. Cressida was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I only want to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. She used a word then almost gently that meant mother, but carried it with a faint emphasis that made it sound like a category rather than a relationship. Brunella said she understood, and that she would be in touch when she was ready, and that she hoped Cressida was well. She said goodbye and hung up before Cressida could redirect the conversation. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, with her hand still on the phone. Then she walked down the hall to Elnathan's study, which she had not entered since the week after the funeral, and she opened the door. The room was exactly as he had left it. That was the thing about Elnathan. He did not leave loose ends. He had never left a project unfinished, never left a book face down on a table or a drawer hanging open. The room carried that same quality of completion. His desk was clean. His notebooks were stacked in the same order they had always occupied on the shelf beside the window. Their spines aligned, their edges even. She crossed to the shelf and stood before it for a moment. Then she took one down. It was one of perhaps a dozen, all bound in the same dark cloth, all worn in the same way at the corners, from being handled regularly rather than left to sit. She opened it to a random page. Numbers, dates, short notations in his familiar handwriting, precise and small, the script of a man who had spent decades working in columns and ledgers and had carried that discipline into everything he put on paper. Nothing remarkable at first glance. A record of something, expenses perhaps, or schedules, she could not immediately tell. She turned the pages slowly. And then she found the one with the folded corner. Elnathan did not fold corners. She had never once seen him fold a corner or crease a spine or mark a page in any way that suggested carelessness. If he wanted to return to something, he used a thin strip of paper as a bookmark, always the same kind, always placed with the same precision. A folded corner meant something. It meant he had come back to this page many times in moments when he did not have a bookmark near to hand, when the urgency of returning to it outweighed his usual careful habits. She unfolded the page and read. It was a list of names, first names only, each one followed by a short notation, a number, a single word, sometimes a date. She moved down the column slowly, and most of the names meant nothing to her, were simply names the way a list of names always is until one of them becomes something more. Near the bottom of the column, written in a slightly darker pressure than the rest, as if the pen had been pressed down with more deliberate force, was the name Soren. Next to it, Elnathan had written 4 words. Winter. Don't let this one fall through. Brunella stood very still. She read the line again. Then she looked at the names above it and below it. She looked at the dates beside some of them, the single words beside others. She was a careful woman, and she did not jump to conclusions, but she had also lived long enough to understand that when something refuses to settle in your chest, it is usually because some part of you already knows what it means. She was still standing there when the doorbell rang. Cressida stood on the front step with an expression that managed to convey both apology and purpose simultaneously. She said she had been in the neighborhood. She held a small paper bag from the bakery on the corner as evidence of this, or perhaps as peace offering. Brunella thanked her for the pastries and said it was good to see her. She kept herself positioned in the doorway in a way that was hospitable without being an invitation. Cressida's eyes moved past her down the hallway toward the open door of the study at the end. Brunella stepped slightly to the left. After Cressida left, Brunella went back to the study and stood looking at the open notebook on the desk where she had set it down. She closed it carefully and replaced it on the shelf in exactly the position it had occupied before. Then she closed the door of the study. She had the distinct and unfamiliar sensation of having protected something, not from Cressida specifically, from being seen before she herself had finished seeing it. That night, she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about Tuesdays, the way you think about something that has always been in the room with you, and that you have, simply for reasons that seem obvious only in retrospect, never turned to look at directly. Elnathan left every Tuesday at nearly the same time. That had been true for as long as she could clearly remember, which meant at least 15 years, probably longer. He was not a man of restless habits. He did not need to get out of the house, did not take long drives for the sake of taking them, did not manufacture errands. When he left the house, he left because he was going somewhere specific for a specific reason. That was who he was. I'll be in Millbrook, meeting Barnwell. She had heard those words dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. They had the quality of settled facts, the kind of thing you stop hearing because it has become part of the background of a life. But here was the thing that surfaced now in the dark. Things she had not examined before because it had not seemed to need examining. Every Tuesday when Elnathan came home, there was a quality in him that was different from the way he came home from other things. Not worse, not better, just different. He was quieter in the first hour, not withdrawn, not troubled, but the way a person is quiet when they are still carrying something they have not quite set down yet, when the thing they went to do has not fully finished happening inside them, even though the doing of it is over. She had thought it was fatigue. He was not a young man, and she had assumed that whatever he was doing in Millbrook was physically tiring in some way she had never needed to examine. The assumption had been comfortable. She had let it be comfortable. Now in the dark, she recognized that quietness for what it actually was. She knew it from her own life, from the days when she had done something that mattered, something that asked something real of her, and had come home changed in some small way by the asking. She turned onto her side. The question that kept rising was not what he had been doing, that she would find out on Tuesday. The question was different, and it was the kind of question that has no comfortable answer and cannot be put away once it has been asked. She had loved this man for 46 years. She had believed she knew him, and she had not known this. Not because he had hidden it from her with any malice. She did not believe that for a moment. Elnathan Voss was not a man capable of malice toward her, but he had carried something without telling her week after week, year after year, and she had let him because the tone of it had never invited her to ask. What else had she let be comfortable when it should have been examined? She did not answer that. She was not sure she was ready to. By morning, the decision had already settled. She had not made it consciously. It had simply arrived in her the way certain decisions do not, as a choice, but as something that was already true and that she was only now acknowledging. She would go to Millbrook on Tuesday, not because she expected to understand everything she found there, but because she could no longer pretend she did not need to. Tuesday arrived with the pale, colorless sky and the kind of cold that settles in old bones before the heat of the day has time to do anything about it. Brunella dressed carefully, not formally, carefully, the way Elnathan used to dress before leaving on Tuesday mornings, as though what she was going to was something that deserved a small amount of preparation. She drove through Fairview and out onto the road toward Millbrook. The landscape was November bare, the trees stripped and holding their branches against the sky with a patience that felt almost deliberate. She passed small houses, a gas station, a closed hardware store, with a hand-lettered sign in the window she did not stop to read. Garrison Road appeared almost without announcement. The storage facility sat back from the road, quiet and unremarkable in the way of places that exist for function rather than appearance. Low metal doors ran in rows down a long concrete corridor. No sign on the building, no indication of what might distinguish one unit from another except numbers on the doors. She parked and sat for a moment. Then she got out and walked inside. The corridor was longer than it looked from the outside. Fluorescent lights overhead, the floor echoing faintly beneath her shoes. She followed the numbers until she found the one Barnwell had given her, and she lifted her hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Barnwell Crane stood in the frame. He was as she remembered him, tall, slightly stooped, lines around his eyes that spoke of years of watching things rather than simply looking at them. His expression when he saw her was neither surprised nor relieved. It was present. That was the word for it. He looked at her the way a person looks when they have been expecting something and it has arrived. He stepped aside. She walked in. The room beyond was not what she had expected. She had not known what she expected, but it had not been this. A long table ran down the center, covered in files stacked with evidence system. Two smaller desks flanked the walls. At one of them, a woman in her late 50s sat writing with a focus so complete that she seemed to have reached an agreement with the room that nothing outside the page in front of her required her attention. She was silver-haired, thin-shouldered, her posture straight in the particular way of someone who has spent years being the steadiest person in difficult rooms. Glasses low on her nose, pen moving without pause. At the other desk, a man in his early 40s leaned over a stack of folders with his sleeves rolled to his elbows. His arms carried the faint record of physical work, old marks that had long since become simply part of him. His dark hair fell forward slightly as he read, and he pushed it back without looking up, a gesture so automatic it was barely a gesture at all. Barnwell said, "That is Aldina. She was a caseworker for 20 years, and that is Farwell. He came to us through Elnathan." Neither of them paused in their work, but Brunella had the sense that both of them were aware of exactly where she was standing and why. She stepped closer to the table. The files were arranged by some logic she could not immediately read. Dates along the edges, notes in different handwriting, some neat and some rushed. She moved her fingers along the top of the nearest stack, not lifting anything, just feeling the edges. Then she moved one folder aside, and then another beneath it. And then she saw the name, Soren. The file was thinner than the others, not neglected. Something else. The kind of thinness that comes from incompletion, from a thing that has been picked up and set back down, and picked up again, that has been waiting for something to allow it to move forward. She lifted it free and opened it. The first page held a photograph. A boy, 7 years old. His hair had been cut without much care, the kind of cut that gets done quickly by someone with other things to manage. The sleeves of his shirt hung past his wrists, the way of clothes that had belonged to someone larger before they came to him. His hands rested on his knees. Still, controlled in a way that was not natural to a child unless the child had spent enough time learning that stillness was safer than motion. His eyes looked toward the camera, but not fully into it. Not looking away, not afraid. Just positioned at that particular angle of a person who has learned to be present without making too many claims on the attention of the room. Brunella felt her breath slow. She had read those eyes described once before. In Elnathan's handwriting in one of the notebooks on the shelf in his study, in a passage she had not fully understood when she read it. Eyes that have learned not to ask. She turned the page. Short notes. Dates. A placement that had not held. A line at the bottom underlined once firmly time-sensitive. No resolution following it. Only space. Only waiting. She stood there with the folder in her hands and did not speak for a long moment. Then she looked up at Barnwell. "I'll take this one," she said. The room did not stop, but something in it shifted the way a room shifts when something that has been unresolved finds a direction. Aldina's pen paused for the length of a single breath before continuing. Farwell looked up and held her gaze for a beat longer than he had before, then nodded once, a nod that carried something more than acknowledgement. Barnwell said nothing, but the set of his shoulders changed, and that said enough. Brunella placed the file on the table in front of her. Not gently, not with ceremony. Firmly, the way you set something down when you want to be sure it cannot be moved without your knowledge. She was still standing in there, her hand on the folder, when Aldina's phone rang. The older woman answered it, listened for 30 seconds, wrote something on a notepad, and ended the call. Then she looked at Barnwell. "Greer called again," Aldina said. "He wants a list of the open cases, all of them." Barnwell was quiet for a moment. "We have never sent him a list," he said. "I know," Aldina said. "That's why he's asking." Brunella did not know who Greer was, but she looked at the way Barnwell and Aldina held each other's eyes for just a fraction too long, and she understood that the name was not new to this room. It was familiar the way a weather pattern is familiar to people who live in a particular place long enough. Not welcome, but expected. She filed the name away and said nothing. She drove home in the early afternoon with the file on the passenger seat beside her. She kept her eyes on the road and both hands on the wheel. The sky had gone a darker gray while she was inside. She turned onto her street and saw the shape of Cressida's car parked at the curb in front of the house. Cressida stood at the door. She was holding a small envelope which she offered to Brunella as she came up the walk. "I found this in your mailbox," she said. "I was just going to drop it through the slot, but I thought I should wait. The return address is the county welfare office." Brunella took the envelope. The name on the front was not hers. It was Elnathan's. Written in the particular way of official correspondence surname, first printed clearly with the formality of institutions that do not concern themselves with the difference between the living and the dead. The postmark was dated 3 days before Elnathan passed. He had never opened it. She looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she looked up at Cressida, who was watching her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Thank you," Brunella said, "for waiting." She went inside and closed the door. She stood in the hallway and looked at the envelope in her hands. Elnathan had known this letter was coming. He had known the name on the return address, had known what office it represented, and he had died 3 days before it arrived. Whatever was inside had been intended for him. Whatever decision it required had been intended to be his. And now it was in her hands instead. She set it on the kitchen table next to the file with Soren's name on it, and she stood between the two of them for a moment, looking from one to the other. Outside, the light was already beginning to fall. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and her reading glasses in place, the way she did everything that required precision. The letter was 2 pages. Official letterhead. The name at the top of the first page was Paxton Greer, Supervisor, Halloway County Office of Child and Family Services. The language was the language of bureaucracy, which is to say it was careful and indirect and said alarming things in the tone of a man reading aloud from a policy manual. It informed Elnathan Voss that the activities conducted at a storage facility on Garrison Road in Millbrook had come to the attention of the county office, that these activities appeared to involve the informal case management of children in the foster care system, that this constituted unauthorized interference with official placement procedures, that Mr. Voss was required to present himself at the county office within 30 days to provide a full accounting of the scope and nature of these activities. That failure to do so would result in a formal referral to the State Oversight Board. The 30-day window had opened 3 days before Elnathan died. It closed in the 6 days. Brunella set the letter down on the table and removed her glasses and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. She sat that way for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. Elnathan had known this was coming. He had known the letter was in the mail, which meant he had known someone had reported the group, which meant he had already been thinking about what to do when it arrived. And then he had died, and the letter had sat in the mailbox for 3 months while the clock ran down, and now there were 6 days left, and she was the only one holding it. She picked up the phone and called Barnwell. She drove to Millbrook the following morning. Not Tuesday, Wednesday. The road looked different on a Wednesday, or perhaps she was simply looking at it differently, with the letter folded in the pocket of her coat, and the sense that she was no longer moving towards something unknown, but towards something she was beginning against her will to understand. Barnwell met her at the door. He read the letter standing up, which told her something. A man sits down to read news he is processing for the first time. A man stays standing when the news confirms something he has already been carrying. He handed it to Aldana without a word. Aldana read it at her desk, set it down, and looked at Barnwell over the top of her glasses. "We knew this was coming," she said. Farwell was the one who said it plainly. He closed the binder in front of him and turned in his chair and looked at Brunella directly in the way of someone who has decided that the situation no longer has room for anything other than directness. "Greer does not want to investigate us," he said. "He wants to close us." Brunella looked at him. She had not yet formed a full impression of Farwell done beyond what she had observed in the room on Tuesday: the focus, the efficiency, the brief nod he had given her when she claimed Soren's file. Now she looked at him more carefully. He was perhaps 42, the kind of man who had built himself through difficulty rather than comfort, whose steadiness was not the steadiness of someone who had never been tested, but of someone who had been tested repeatedly and had decided each time to remain. There was a directness in his face that was not aggression. It was the directness of someone who had learned that clarity was a form of respect. He explained what he knew about Paxton Greer in the same direct way. A career bureaucrat, not corrupt, not cruel, but a man whose understanding of the world was organized entirely around systems and their proper functioning. Every case the Garrison Group resolved outside official channels was to Greer evidence that the official channels were being circumvented, and a man who had built his career on the integrity of those channels experienced circumvention as a personal challenge. "He does not hate children," Farwell said. "He hates what we represent. We are proof that the system fails, and the system is what he has given his life to." Brunella thought about that. She had spent her career as an administrator in a county school district, and she understood the particular psychology Farwell was describing. She had seen it in people she respected, the way belief in an institution could become indistinguishable from the institution itself, so that an attack on one felt like an attack on the other. "That makes him more dangerous," she said. "Not less." Farwell looked at her as though she had said something he had not expected. Then he nodded. They agreed that the letter had to be answered. The question was how. It was Barnwell who said what none of them had said yet. "Elnathan had a plan for this," he said. "He just didn't have time to use it." The room went quiet in a particular way. Brunella looked at him. "What kind of plan?" Barnwell pulled a chair close to the table and sat down. He was not a man who sat down lightly. When Barnwell Crane sat down, it meant he had decided something was worth the full weight of his attention, and he was asking for the same in return. "What I am about to tell you," he said, "I have not told anyone outside this room. I am telling you because Elnathan would have told you himself, and because I think you need to understand what this work is before you decide how far you are willing to carry it." Brunella placed her hands flat on the table in front of her and waited. Barnwell Crane had been 16 years old in December of 1961. His family lived on the east side of Millbrook in a house that was modest but warm. His father a carpenter, his mother a woman who cooked for any gathering that needed feeding. The neighborhood was the kind of neighborhood that no longer quite exists in America, where people knew each other's business not out of nosiness, but out of proximity and shared circumstance. There was a boy, 8 years old, Elnathan Voss, placed by the county welfare office with a family 2 streets over in October of that year. The placement had lasted 6 weeks before the family returned him. No explanation given in any record that Barnwell had ever been able to find. Just a notation that the placement had ended and a new one had not yet been arranged. It was December. It was cold in the particular way of New England winters that has nothing romantic about it. Barnwell's father found him, not dramatically, not in a moment that could be made into a story, just a man who noticed a child sitting on a curb in the late afternoon when children should not be sitting on curbs, and who stopped and asked a question and received an answer that required a response. He did not call anyone. He did not fill out a form. He brought the boy inside and gave him soup and said nothing to Elnathan about how long he could stay because he did not know how long, and he was not a man who made promises he could not keep. He said only that it was warm inside and that there was no reason to be outside when it was this cold. Elnathan stayed 11 weeks, long enough for the worst of the winter to pass, long enough for the county to arrange something else, something that held this time, and then he left. Barnwell paused there. He did not stay, he said, but he stayed long enough. Brunella said, long enough for what? Barnwell met her eyes, long enough to know what it felt like not to be left outside. The room was quiet for a moment. Farwell had stopped pretending to work. Aldina had set her pen down. Brunella felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite recognition, but something that lived between them. She thought about Elnathan coming home on Tuesday evenings carrying something he had not set down yet. She thought about the notebooks, the list of names, the deliberate pressure of the pen on Soren's name. He spent 50 years giving other children the thing your father gave him, she said to Barnwell. It was not a question. Barnwell nodded, and he never told a single person outside this room why. She understood it then, not fully, but enough. Elnathan had not kept this from her out of distrust. He had kept it because some things felt too close to the bone to survive being spoken aloud too often. If you talked about it too much, it started to feel like something you did for the credit, and Elnathan Voss had not been interested in credit. She did not say any of this. She held it. Then she asked the question that had been waiting since Barnwell began. Why are you telling me this now? She said. Because you need to understand what Greer is threatening to close, Barnwell said. Not just a room with files in it. He paused. 50 years of paying a debt that no accounting system would recognize. They drove out to see Soren that afternoon. Farwell drove. Brunella sat in the back with the file on her lap, not opening it, just keeping her hand on it. Aldina had confirmed the address that morning, a small house on the western edge of a neighborhood that had been built in the 60s and had aged in the way of places where people worked hard and worried about money and kept their yards anyway. The Halsey house was clean and modest. A storm door with a screen that needed replacing. A pot of dead geraniums on the front step that no one had gotten around to removing. Mrs. Halsey opened the door before they knocked the way people do when they have been watching from the window. She was a compact woman in her mid-60s with the efficient movements of someone who had spent a lifetime managing more than she was given resources to manage. She was not unkind. She was tired in a way that had passed through fatigue into something more structural. Soren is in the kitchen, she said. We told the agency last week that we can't continue past next month. My husband's health. She said it without apology because it was not something to apologize for. It was simply true. Brunella followed her through a small living room into the kitchen. Soren was sitting at the table. A book was open in front of him, but he was not reading it. He was watching the door in the way of someone who has developed an accurate sense of when adults are about to appear and has learned to be already oriented toward them before they arrive. He was exactly as the photograph had shown him, small for 7, still in that controlled way. The book in front of him was about trains. Brunella sat down in the chair across from him without asking permission. She did not perform cheerfulness. She did not tilt her head and use the voice adults use with children when they are trying to indicate that everything is fine when it clearly is not. She just sat down and looked at him the way she would look at anyone she was genuinely interested in knowing. He looked back at her with the same directness. After a moment, he said, "Are you here to take me somewhere or to tell me I'm staying?" His voice was flat and even, not hostile, just precise. He had asked the question before, or questions like it enough times to have worn the emotion out of the asking. Brunella said, "I don't know yet. I came to meet you." He held her gaze for a beat longer than most adults expected children to hold a gaze. Then he looked back down at the book about trains. It was not a dismissal. It was the response of someone who had been given an honest answer and had decided it was acceptable. On the drive back, Farwell said nothing for several miles. Then he said, "The way you answered him, Elnathan would have answered the same way." Brunella looked out to the window at the passing bare trees. She did not respond because she did not know what to do with that yet. Paxton Greer arrived at Garrison Road 4 days before the letter's deadline. He knocked. Barnwell opened the door. They stood in the frame, neither man inviting the confrontation or retreating from it. Greer was perhaps 52. He wore a coat that was not expensive but was well maintained, the coat of a man who understood that appearance communicated authority without needing to announce it. His face was neither warm nor cold. It was the face of a man who had made a career of being neither of existing in the register of institutional neutrality, where decisions are easier to defend. He was not aggressive. That was the thing Brunella noticed first watching from just inside the room. What he offered instead was the particular pressure of reasonableness, the pressure of a man who believes he is right and has organized all of his evidence to prove it. He said he understood what the group was attempting to do, that he had reviewed the limited information available to his office, and he respected the intention behind it. He said the word intention with a slight emphasis that made it do two things at once: acknowledge the goodwill while separating it from the question of legitimacy. He said there was no formal registration, no liability coverage, no mandatory reporting compliance. He said that in his experience, well-meaning informal networks created gaps, and that children in those gaps were the ones who suffered when something went wrong. Barnwell said, "The children in our files are already in the gaps. That is why they are in our files." Greer looked at him for a moment. He did not argue the point. He said, "I have 30 days of authority here, and most of them are gone. After the deadline, I have an obligation to escalate. I am telling you this as a courtesy." He left. The door closed. Farwell turned from the window where he had been standing. "He does not think he is the villain," he said. "That is the problem." Brunella sat down in the chair nearest to the table. Not Elnathan's chair. She was not ready for that. She placed both hands flat on the wood and thought about what she would need to bring to a meeting with Paxton Greer to move a man who could not be shamed and could not be outmaneuvered by appeals to conscience. That night, Cressida called again. Brunella was in the study with the notebooks open on the desk when the phone rang. She had spent the past hour going through them carefully one by one, and she had begun to understand the full scope of what Elnathan had built across 15 years. Every case noted, every outcome tracked. The money column on the right side of certain pages, small amounts, regular intervals tracking the costs of what could not be done for free. Cressida said she had spoken to her attorney. She said there were questions about account withdrawals over a 15-year period that had not been addressed during probate. She said the amounts were not large individually, but that the pattern was irregular and that any responsible handling of the estate required an accounting. Brunella looked at the open notebook in front of her. The column of amounts on the right: rent for the garrison unit, supplies. Once a notation that said simply placement gap December with an amount beside it that corresponded to what it would have cost to ensure a child did not lose a bed between one placement and the next in the coldest week of that particular year. Cressida said, "I only want transparency. Surely that's reasonable." Brunella said, "I will call you tomorrow." She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. Elnathan looked at her from the photograph on the desk, the one taken at their 30th anniversary, his expression carrying that particular quality of a man who has just said something true and is waiting to see if it lands. She picked up the phone again and called Aldina. "I need to know everything about how the notebooks are organized," she said, "before Tuesday." Aldina arrived the next morning. They sat at Brunella's kitchen table with 3 of Elnathan's notebooks open between them and coffee going cold in their cups, while Aldina explained the system, the shorthand, the coding along the margins, the way outcomes had been cross-referenced across different years. Aldina was not warm in the way of people who perform warmth. She was something more useful, which was precise. She gave information clearly and without embellishment and did not fill the spaces between facts with reassurance. At one point, she stopped and looked at Brunella directly. "He found me," she said. "Not the other way. I had left the county office 3 years before because I had spent 20 years watching children go into the system, and I needed to stop watching that happen without being able to do anything about it. Elnathan called me on a Thursday afternoon and said he had been given my name by someone whose name he would not share, and that he had a question. The question was whether I would be willing to look at a particular file and tell him if there was anything that could still be changed." She paused. "I looked at the file," she said. "There was something. We changed it. And I came back the following Tuesday, and I have not stopped coming back." "Did he tell you why he started it?" Brunella said. "Originally." Aldina looked down at the notebook. "He told me once," she said. "He said there was a winter when he was 8 years old and a man opened a door for him. He said he had spent a long time trying to figure out what you owed a thing like that." She looked up. "He decided you owed it forward, indefinitely." Brunella was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out the folded piece of paper with the 5 names on it. She set it on the table between them. Aldina looked at it without asking what it was. She recognized it. "He showed me that list once," Aldina said. "He said keeping it was the only honest thing he could do about it. That forgetting would have been a kind of lie." Brunella looked at the 5 names. Then she folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. "I am going to meet with Greer," she said. "Before the deadline, alone." Aldina looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." That was all. No argument, no qualification. The same quality of alignment Brunella had heard before in that room, which she was beginning to understand was not agreement, but something more essential, the recognition that the right person was moving in the right direction, and the appropriate response was to step aside and let them go. The call from Farwell came that evening. He had spoken to Mrs. Halsey. The timeline was confirmed. They could not keep Soren past the end of the month. The county had already been notified, and Paxton Greer had been informed, and Greer had initiated the process of arranging a transfer to a group facility in an adjacent county. The facility was licensed. It was not a bad place by the standards that existed for measuring such things. But it was 40 minutes away, and it served children between 5 and 12, and it operated on a model designed for volume rather than for the particular and specific needs of a 7-year-old boy who asked questions in a flat voice and read books about trains and had learned not to expect answers. Then Farwell said, "L. Nathan wrote his name in that notebook over a year ago. He had been watching the case that long, waiting for the right moment to move on it." Brunella held the phone and looked at Soren's file on the kitchen table next to the letter from Greer. The two pieces of paper that had arrived in her life within hours of each other on the same afternoon, as though whatever L. Nathan had been building had decided it could not wait any longer for its next caretaker. L. Nathan had known, she said. He had known the window was closing. "Yes," Farwell said. "And he died before he could move." "Yes." She looked at the file. She looked at the photograph. She had already memorized the boy with the controlled hands and the quiet waiting in his eyes. Then she said, "I will call Barnwell tonight. We meet on Tuesday as planned, and on Wednesday I go to see Greer." Farwell said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Brunella." It was the first time he had used her name. She noticed that. "Yes," she said. "He would have chosen you," he said. "I want you to know that. If he had known he was running out of time, he would have chosen you." She said goodnight to Farwell and set the phone down. She stood at the kitchen table with her hands on the edge of the wood and looked at the two pieces of paper in front of her. One was a threat to everything L. Nathan had built. The other was the reason it mattered. She picked up Soren's file and held it in both hands and thought about a boy sitting at a kitchen table with a book about trains, asking the only question he had left to ask. She thought about L. Nathan at 8 years old sitting on a curb in December, and a man who had not asked for paperwork before opening a door. She thought about the 5 names on the folded paper in her pocket, the ones who had not had a Tuesday, and she thought about what L. Nathan had written beside them. "In case you ever need a reason." She had her reason. She placed the file back on the table and went to find the telephone number for the county office. She called the county office at 8:15 on Monday morning and asked for Paxton Greer by name. The woman who answered put her on hold for long enough that Brunella understood it was not a technical delay, but a considered one, the kind of pause that institutions use to remind callers of their relative position. She waited it out without impatience. She had prepared for this call the way L. Nathan would have prepared, which was to say she had done it the night before in her head, running through the possible directions it could go, and deciding in advance how she would respond to each of them. Greer came on the line, measured, neither warm nor cool. She said her name. She said she was Nathan Voss's wife. She said she had the letter he had sent her husband and that she would like to meet with him before the deadline at his convenience. There was a brief pause, then he said he could see her Wednesday morning at 10. She said, "Thank you, I will be there." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table with L. Nathan's 3 most recent notebooks open in front of her. She had brought Cressida's copies of the bank statements home from the study the night before and placed them beside the notebooks. She sat with all of it in front of her and worked until nearly midnight, cross-referencing dates against entries matching the small, regular withdrawals Cressida had flagged against the corresponding notations in L. Nathan's records. Every withdrawal had an entry. Every entry had an outcome. The record was complete. It was not the record of a man with something to hide. It was the record of a man who understood that accountability was the price of doing something real. She closed the notebooks and stacked them carefully and went to bed. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. Tuesday, she went to Garrison Road. The room was already moving when she arrived. Aldina at her desk, Farwell at his, Barnwell near the window, which was where he always stood when he was thinking about something he had not yet decided to say aloud. She walked to the table and looked at the files arranged across it. Then she looked at the chair at the head of the table. L. Nathan's chair. In 4 weeks of coming to this room, she had always taken the chair to its left, the secondary position, the position of someone still learning the room. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the files. Then she sat down in Elnathan's chair. No one stopped working. No one looked up with ceremony. But Barnwell turned from the window and looked at her, and what was in his face was not surprise and not sentimentality. It was the recognition of a man who has been waiting for something to find its proper place and has just watched it do so. She put her hand on the nearest file. "Which one do we start with?" she said. Aldina slid a folder across the table without looking up. "This one has a 2-week window before the placement expires," she said. "If we move by Friday, we have a chance." Brunella opened it. The work began. She went to see Cressida that afternoon. Not because she had planned to, because she drove past Cressida Street on the way home from Garrison Road and made the turn without deliberating about it, the way you do when a decision has already been made below the level of conscious thought and the conscious mind is only catching up. Cressida answered the door in the clothes of someone who had been working at home, slightly surprised, trying not to show it. Brunella said, "May I come in?" Cressida stepped back and let her through. They sat at Cressida's kitchen table. Brunella set the folder she had brought on the table between them. Inside were the bank statements Cressida had raised concerns about, with Elnathan's corresponding notebook entries printed on separate pages and placed beside each withdrawal date, matched to date amount, matched to amount. Cressida picked up the first page. Read it, turned to the second. Her eyes moved down the column of entries. Brunella watched her face move through several things in sequence, the alert readiness of someone looking for discrepancy, then the gradual adjustment as the discrepancy failed to materialize, then something that was harder to name. She set the papers down. "How long did he do this?" she said. Brunella said 15 years that I can document. Probably longer before the notebooks I found. Cressida looked at the table. "He never said anything," she said. "Not once." "No," Brunella said. "That was not how he was built." Cressida was quiet for a long moment. Then she said quietly enough that it almost did not reach across the table. "I spent 3 years after Robert died, being angry at Elnathan for not being more, for not reaching out more, not saying more. I thought he was reserved because he was indifferent. He was reserved because some things cost him something to carry," Brunella said, "and he was not interested in putting the cost on display." Cressida nodded once slowly. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Nothing," Brunella said. "I came because you deserve to know, not because I needed something from you." She gathered the papers and stood up. Cressida said, "Brunella." She turned. "If there is ever anything I can do," Cressida said, "for the work." Brunella looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I will let you know." Wednesday morning, she drove to the county office. The building was functional and dated the kind of public building constructed in the 1970s with the understanding that utility was sufficient. Brunella had worked in buildings like this for most of her career. She knew how to move through them. The receptionist brought her to a conference room on the second floor. She sat down and placed Elnathan's 3 notebooks on the table in front of her and waited. Paxton Greer came in 2 minutes after 10. He shook her hand with the practiced courtesy of a man who had conducted hundreds of these meetings. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table. He said he was sorry for her loss in the measured register of a man for whom condolence was a procedural element of the meeting. Brunella said, "Thank you." Then she opened the first notebook and turned it to face him. She did not begin with an argument. She began with a fact. She said, "My husband kept a complete record of every case this group has touched in the past 15 years. Every decision, every outcome, every cost. The record is not the record of people who believed they were above accountability. It is the record of people who held themselves to a higher standard of accountability than the system required because they understood that the children in these files could not afford mistakes." Greer looked at the notebook without touching it yet. He was reading it from where he sat, which told her he was taking it seriously, even as he maintained the posture of a man who had not yet been moved. She said, "I know what your concern is, and I want to tell you that I share it. An informal network with no oversight is a liability. You are right about that. But I want to show you something." She opened to a page near the middle of the second notebook. "This case," she said, 19 months ago, a 9-year-old boy in a placement that was failing. Edmund identified a licensed foster family in the same school district who were not in the system because they had found the application process prohibitive. Aldina helped them complete the paperwork. The boy is still in the same school, still with the same family. She turned to another page. She did not say anything about this one. She just let him read. He leaned forward slightly. She turned to another, and then another. She did not skip the cases that hadn't resolved well. 2 where the timing hadn't been right. One where a family had fallen through at the last moment. She showed him those too. She said my husband kept those because he believed that intellectual honesty about failure was the only way to do better next time. Greer sat back. He looked at the notebooks for a long moment. Then he said, "These are impressive records, Mrs. Voss, but they do not resolve the liability question." She had been waiting for that. She reached into her bag and took out a single sheet of paper and placed it on the table between them. It was the list of 5 names, the ones Elnathan had not reached. She had written above it in her own handwriting, the same line Elnathan had written, "In case you ever need a reason." She watched Greer look at it. She said there was a boy named Soren, 7 years old, currently at the Halsey home on the west side of Millbrook. His placement ends in 3 weeks. Your office has initiated a transfer to a group facility in the next county. My husband had been watching his case for over a year. He identified a window to place Soren with the family who wanted to provide a permanent home and had the capacity to do so. He died before he could move on it. Greer looked at her. She said, "I am asking for 30 days. To find Soren a permanent placement through whatever combination of formal and informal channels is required. In exchange, I will ensure that every active case currently in our files is documented in a format compatible with your office's reporting requirements. Not because we have anything to hide, because transparency is what this work deserves." Greer was quiet for what felt like a full minute. She did not fill it. He picked up the list of 5 names and looked at it. Then he set it down. He said, "I cannot officially endorse an unlicensed operation." She said, "I know. I am not asking you to endorse it. I am asking you to give me 30 days. He looked at the notebooks again. Then he looked at her. "You understand," he said, "that if anything goes wrong during those 30 days. "I understand," she said. He nodded once. 30 days, he said. Not a day more. She gathered the notebooks and placed them back in her bag and stood. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Greer. I mean that." He did not respond immediately, but as she reached the door, he said, "Mrs. Voss." She turned. He said, "The documentation you described, the format compatible with our reporting requirements." He paused. If that were to become a model for how informal networks communicate with county offices. He stopped there as though he had said more than he had intended to. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I will be in touch." She was in the parking lot before she allowed herself to breathe fully. The first Saturday came quickly. Brunella was in her kitchen at 6 in the morning, sleeves rolled, moving through the preparation with the focused quiet of someone who has converted anxiety into usefulness. She had called Pastor Thessaly Birch 3 days earlier, and the conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes because Thessaly Birch was a woman who did not require extensive context to act. Elnathan had called her years ago, she had said. She had been ready since. Barnwell arrived first, as Brunella had known he would. He came through the back door with his coat still on and picked up a dish towel without being asked and began doing what needed doing. Farwell came 20 minutes later. He said nothing when he walked in. He looked at the counter, assessed what had been done and what remained, and moved to fill the gap. Aldina arrived last with 2 additional thermoses of coffee and the particular expression of someone who has agreed to something new and is reserving judgment until she has seen how it goes. They loaded everything into 2 vehicles and drove to the hospital first. Pastor Thessaly's volunteers were already there when they arrived, 12 people of varying ages, moving with the coordinated ease of people who had done this kind of work before and understood that efficiency was a form of care. The cafeteria filled slowly, trays moved, coffee was poured. The room had the particular sound of a place where people who have been alone with difficult things are for a little while not alone with them. Brunella moved through the room with the quiet attention she had been developing over the past several weeks, the ability to be present without announcing herself, to see without requiring acknowledgement. She was near the far end of the room when she saw him. Soren sat at a table along the wall. The Halseys had brought him as she had asked Farwell to arrange. He had a tray in front of him, and he was eating, which was itself different from the first time she had seen him, when the book had been open and untouched. He was present in a different way today. More forward in his chair, less contained. A woman from Thessaly's congregation was talking to him. An older woman, perhaps 70, with the unhurried manner of someone who had decided long ago that children deserved to be spoken to in the same register as everyone else. Soren was listening with the focus he brought to everything, the careful attention of a child who had learned that information was worth having because it was rarely offered freely. Then the woman said something that made him smile. It was small, almost uncertain, as though his face was relearning a movement it had once known. But it was real in the way that only unguarded things are real, in the way that cannot be performed or produced on demand. Brunella stood where she was. She did not move closer. She thought about Nathan coming home on Tuesday evenings carrying something he had not set down yet. Now she understood what it was. It was this, the specific and unrepeatable weight of having been in the room when something like that happened, when a child who had learned not to ask had been given without ceremony or announcement a reason to. She stayed where she was until Soren finished eating. He found her near the end, not because she sought him out. He came around the edge of the room in that deliberate way he had the way of a child who moved with intention, because moving without intention had taught him things he did not want to keep learning. He stopped a few feet from her. He said, "Was he here before, the man who put my name in the book?" "Not here," she said, "but he would have been if he could." Soren considered that. He had the quality in these moments of someone turning a fact over to examine all of its sides before accepting it. He said, "Did he know me?" She said he knew enough. He knew what mattered. Soren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to say thank you to him." She had been prepared for many things in this conversation. She had not been prepared for exactly that. She said, "He knows. People who do good work quietly, they always know." Soren looked at her for a moment with that direct, undeflected gaze. Then he said, "Are you going to keep coming?" She said, "Every Saturday, and every Tuesday before that." He nodded once in the manner of someone receiving information they intend to act on. Then he turned and went back to the table where the woman from Thessaly's congregation was still sitting, and he sat down across from her, and the conversation resumed. Brunella stood there for a long time after that. She had been a widow for 4 months. She had been coming to Garrison Road for 5 weeks. The grief had not left. It had simply found a different relationship to the rest of what was inside her. It moved from the center to the side, not because it mattered less, because other things had grown large enough to share the space. The afternoon came, and the trays were cleared, and the room gradually emptied. Soren left with the Halseys. At the door, he turned and looked back once, not at the room, at her. Then he went through the door. Pastor Thessaly found Brunella near the window afterward, the room nearly empty around them. Thessaly was a woman whose age showed in her hands more than her face, hands that had done substantial work over many years and wore it without apology. She stood beside Brunella and looked out at the parking lot. Nathan called me 7 years ago," Thessaly said. "He asked me a single question. He asked whether if a network like the one he was building ever needed to grow there, would be infrastructure to support it. I told him yes. He said, 'Good. I will call you when it is time.'" She paused. "He never called back," she said, "but I kept it ready. That is what faith looks like sometimes. Just keeping something ready." Brunella said, "He was still deciding, I think, who to hand it to." Thessaly looked at her. "I do not think he was still deciding," she said gently. "I think he was waiting for the right moment to tell you that he had already decided." Brunella did not respond to that. She let it sit in her chest where it would do what it needed to do. 3 weeks later, Soren found a permanent home. It came through Thessaly's congregation, a couple in their early 50s named the Brannons, who had tried for years through the formal system and had encountered the kind of procedural difficulty that discourages people who do not have the patience or the resources to persist. Aldina spent 4 days helping them complete the documentation correctly. Farwell made 2 phone calls to a licensing contact he had developed over 3 years of Tuesday mornings. The Brannons met Soren on a Saturday at the same cafeteria at the same table near the wall. Brunella was not there for that meeting. She had arranged it and then deliberately not attended because she understood that what needed to happen in that room did not require her presence, and that her presence might complicate the particular thing she was trying to protect. Farwell called her that evening. He said he asked them if they liked trains. She said, "What did they say?" Farwell said Mr. Brannon said he did not know much about trains, but he was willing to learn. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Good." That was the right answer. Cressida called on a Sunday morning in early December, 4 days after Soren's placement was finalized. She did not call about paperwork or attorneys. She said she had been thinking. She said she had spoken to Thessaly Birch, which Brunella had not known, and that she understood there was need for more people on Saturdays. She said, "I do not know what I can offer, but I have time on Saturdays, and I can follow instructions." Brunella said 10 o'clock, Thessaly's church. "Bring comfortable shoes." Cressida said, "I will be there." They were both quiet for a moment. Then Cressida said, "Brunella, I am sorry for the phone calls about the estate, for the assumption that there was something to find." Brunella said, You did not know who he was. I'm not sure I knew who he was, not fully, so there is nothing to forgive. Cressida was quiet for long enough that Brunella knew she was absorbing something rather than preparing a response. Then she said, he was lucky to have you. Brunella thought about that. She thought about 46 years of Tuesday mornings, about a list of 5 names kept in a folded paper in a notebook, about a man who had spent half a century paying forward something given to him in December of 1961 by a carpenter who asked no questions and made no promises. She said we were lucky to have each other. That is how it works when it works. The last Tuesday of November, Brunella arrived at Garrison Road before anyone else. She had not planned to. She had left the house earlier than usual because the morning had the quality of a morning that did not want to be sat through, that wanted to be moved through instead. She drove to Millbrook in the early gray light and parked and let herself into the building with the key Barnwell had given her 3 weeks earlier. The room was quiet and dark. She turned on the fluorescent lights and stood for a moment while they settled into their even hum. She went to the table and sat down in Elnathan's chair. She put her hands flat on the wood. She looked at the stacked files. She looked at the 2 desks against the walls. She looked at the window where Barnwell stood when he was thinking. She thought about a 16-year-old boy and a door opened in December. She thought about 11 weeks long enough to last 50 years. She thought about a man who tapped a clock before he left and came home carrying something he could not always set down at the door. She thought about what Barnwell had said. A man does not know what he is building. He only does the right thing week after week until the right thing is larger than he is. Elnathan had known, she thought. He had known better than Barnwell gave him credit for. He had kept meticulous records. He had called Thessaly Birch and asked about infrastructure. He had written to Aldina. I am still deciding who that is. He had kept a list of the ones he did not reach and written beside it in case you ever need a reason. He had known. He had simply been waiting for the right time to show her, and then he had run out of time. She thought he should have told me sooner. And then quieter, he told me exactly when he could. And I am here. The door opened. Barnwell came in and stopped when he saw her already seated. He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to the window and stood in his usual place and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Farwell came in behind him. Then Aldina with her coat still on and her pen already in her hand. The files were opened. The work began. And somewhere in Millbrook, in a house on a street, Brunella had not yet visited, but would a boy who had learned not to ask was beginning in the careful and non-linear way of children who have been hurt and are choosing against the available evidence to try again to unlearn it. Outside the window, the sky was the pale gray of early winter, the kind of sky that gives nothing away about what it intends to do next. Brunella put her hand on the first file. She did not look at the clock. She did not need to. She already knew what day it was. It was Tuesday, and she was here.